So, fittingly for the creativity conference, and I guess we're in the first time slot too. What is creativity, and how should we be thinking about it? And what insights can we glean from folks that have done cool creative things in the past? So, a lot of people think of creativity as just a big blank sheet of paper. And there is that style of creativity, to be sure. And you can have that blank sheet of paper, and you can even go all Jackson Pollock on it and go wild. But that's not the kind of creativity that I'll be discussing today. The kind of creativity I'll be discussing today is creativity within constraints. So what kind of constraints? Let's talk a little bit about that. In other words, not a blank sheet of paper, but in fact, constraints. Here are some examples of constraints. Time constraint, right? You only have X amount of time to put something together. Space constraints, you only have so much space. Cost, right? How much money do you have to get the job done? And mission, what are you trying to accomplish? Those kinds of constraints are very different from the blank sheet of paper scenario. And what I'll be doing today is covering some examples from widely differing pursuits and times in history to give a feel for how constraints actually helped people be more creative, and how you can think about constraints as helping you be more creative. Because in theory, you could do anything. You could wake up in the morning and do absolutely anything. And constraints are what help us guide our efforts so that we're doing something that makes sense, and hopefully something that's more creative. So my first example is actually one from history. It's Michelangelo's David. And the interesting thing about David that not everyone may know is that, in fact, he had some very significant constraints, because Michelangelo was not starting from scratch. There was actually a big misshapen slab of marble that had been bought for a different project and had been sitting there for 35 years, actually, without anyone quite figuring out what they could do with it. But it was huge. In fact, it had a nickname. How many pieces of marble have a nickname? It was called Il Gigante, the giant slab of marble. And it probably looked a little bit like this, but much, much larger, of course. And it was a funky shape. It wasn't a straight rectangular slab. It had some kind of ins and outs to it. So he had to look at that and figure out what to do with it, and come up with a way to make that work as a commission. And of course, as we all know, where he ended up was amazing, right? He took this slab of marble. He figured out how he could use pretty much the whole length and breadth of it to put together this fabulous sculpture that's probably the #1 sculpture people think of today in the world. So he was able to kind of translate that very difficult starting point of kind of an orphaned piece of marble with weird dimensions, and figure out where to put the hands, the feet, the head, even the gap between the legs. Everything had to kind of fit. And it's unlikely that this would have been as good a sculpture if he hadn't had those constraints. In fact, there's a lot of discussion that previous sculptures of David had included things like the head of Goliath, or different objects, or maybe the him actually in some kind of action pose, but there wasn't room for that in the slab that was available. So instead, you end up with this very unique and kind of constrained, but unbelievably accomplished sculpture. So for my second example, fast forward to 1970, Apollo 13. And many of you may know this story from the movie, but I thought it would be worth recapping a little bit here. In the 70s, there were these series of missions to the moon. And for those of you who are deep into conspiracy theories, there's all kinds of reasons why it actually happened. And there's plenty of footage and so forth. So don't be bashful if you need to research it. Anyway, on their way to the moon, the configuration of these things was that they had a command module, which is the thing on the left, the upper left, and they had a lunar module, which is the thing on the right. And they were bolted together at the midpoint. And as they got close to the moon, they would separate. And then the command module would keep orbiting and the lunar module would go down. But what happened was on their way to the moon, and just actually going around, I believe, the backside, the first time, they heard an explosion. And this was the source of the famous quote, Houston, we have a problem. Although it turns out it didn't actually say, Houston, we have a problem. It's Houston, we've had a problem. Slight difference, but I don't know, maybe not as catchy. And the problem was that basically these tanks of liquid oxygen, which held the oxygen that the astronauts were going to breathe for the rest of the mission, one of them had exploded. And it exploded because they had a little stirring device inside that would keep them from, I don't know, freezing up or something. And that stirring device had malfunctioned, and boom, the tank had exploded. And not just exploded, but basically, as you see here from this photo, it had blown off the entire side of the command module, which is a kind of a shocking view. So the guys were trapped inside this thing. A big chunk of their oxygen supply had just kind of self-defeated, and they had to figure out what they were going to do. Obviously, going to the moon was out of the question at this point, like landing. But the previous Apollo missions before the Apollo 11 that landed had done just orbits and things like that and come back. So they knew how to do that. But the question was how to get back, because they were going to run out of oxygen at almost any moment. And in fact, the oxygen levels in the capsule were already dropping. So what they decided to do was rig up something. They basically had to take the oxygen supply system from the lunar module, which was supposed to land on the moon, and rig it up to sort of replace the oxygen system on the command module. And luckily, the lunar module oxygen system was intact. But unfortunately, none of the systems fit together. In fact, the filter on one was round and on the other was square. So they had to figure out a way to glom them together so that they could take the oxygen out of the lunar module and bring it into the command module. Now, this is the ultimate set of constraints, because they were in space, in a can, basically, with very limited tools, things like duct tape and, knives and screwdrivers, but very basic tools. And they had to figure out how to put together a hybrid oxygen supply unit. Now, luckily, they had ground control, and ground control worked on this, 24/7 until they figured it out. In fact, they built a prototype. So they figured out that if you tape together the two mismatched systems and then wrapped it in plastic and sort of sealed it shut, and then the air would actually go through the filter and come out, and it's called a scrubber, and come out and be able to be breathed by the astronauts. So this is a guy in the beautifully styled sport coat down at Houston who was holding the prototype. And this was all done in a matter of hours. So then what they did is they walked them through building the same thing in space with the tools at their disposal, including, as you see here, the gray duct tape. So that rectangle is in fact what they built. And then they were testing it out with the oxygen tubes there. So making sure that it actually worked. And then they installed it right in between the lunar module and the command module. So this is where it ended up. So that's the hatch between the two systems. Pretty amazing. And they literally built it all with instructions from the ground in a matter of hours as their oxygen was coming down. Like they were already getting short of breath. So, talk about constraints, very little time, very little space, very few tools, a very tightly described mission. And they had to, of course, make it back to Earth with this equipment that they were building. Amazing. But they did. They made it back, which is kind of amazing. So unfortunately, they didn't get to land on the moon, which is a bummer. But hey, you have to take these things in perspective. And on the positive note, they were alive. So that's a good thing. So that was an amazing example of creativity under pressure, right? There was no plan for doing something like that. No one had anticipated that this thing would blow the side off their spaceship. And, they had to literally figure it out on the fly. I think it was less than 24 hours that they were able to come up with a detailed design. So awesome. Okay, third example. This one's a little closer to home for me. It's all the adjustments that people made in the media industry during COVID. Because of course, and we're still in the midst of this, but if you go back to last March, there was a very abrupt switch from business as usual to like, oh my God, we got to get the show on the air, and we have no idea how to do that. We have dozens of customers who have gone through this process in very rapid fashion. I'll talk about one of them here, which is American Public Television. But there are many, many more. I can also talk a little bit about, for instance, Warner Brothers, who's another of our customers, and NBC Universal. So big media companies, but also small ones like documentary makers, sports teams, all kinds of folks that had to figure out new ways of getting their jobs done. In the case of American Public Television, they had to go from working at the office, and our software is in the upper right. It's called Axel, and it basically lets you search your media and do things like automatic transcription and so forth. But that, luckily for us and luckily for our customers, it works in your browser. So what they were able to do is within a 48-hour period, switch all 40 of their workers from working at the office at their desks to doing the exact same thing from home. And this is in fact one of their staff had set up a kind of home rig very similar to what he had at the office. And you can tell it's a home rig from the door on the right. That's clearly not an office type fixture there. But he was able to do this like in record time and basically use the same software from home that he had been using at work, because it all ran in a browser. Now, if you go back a few years, teams like this were actually handing around hard drives. So they were like, using, even going back a little further, they were passing around tapes. And then more recently, hard drives, things like this. So to go from that kind of very manual in-person workflow to a streamlined browser workflows is a big deal. And then being able to search your material and so forth from home. That's not the only adjustment that people made, though. I was talking to one producer at Warner Brothers. He was responsible for a lot of their interview shows, and they had to go from like in-person on-set interviews to using Zoom and Skype and whatever they could get their hands on pretty much, literally within a matter of days. And he was responsible for keeping 5 or 6 different shows on the air during that time. So he was pulling all-nighters and training people how to use Zoom for the first time. And you can only imagine what hoops they had to jump through. So it was a pretty amazing adjustment that was made by the industry. And we're proud to have been a part of it. But it's the kind of thing that people have to do when unforeseen circumstances arise. So for my next example, I'm going to be talking, and actually this is example 4A, and my final example is 4B. I'm going to be talking about one of my favorite movies, which is Monty Python and the Holy Grail. Now, for those who don't know this, it's a 1975 movie. It's a comedy about the Middle Ages. It's if you haven't seen it, it's definitely worth a look. It's one of these, bucket list type movies that show up on lists of movies you have to see. At any rate, what's cool about it is that they had really minimal budget to shoot and produce the movie. And when I say minimal, I mean minimal. It was about 200,000 pounds, which at that time translated to, I think, $350,000 for the whole movie. And this is a very elaborate period piece with costumes and sets and shot on location, so there was a lot of volunteering going on, a lot of interns. But it's amazing. Interestingly, the money that they got to shoot the movie was largely sourced from 1970s British rock bands, because Monty Python had put out albums through a record company that also managed a lot of the big bands of the period. So for instance, Led Zeppelin and Genesis and Jethro Tull, all these like British bands, each one put up like 20 grand. And then they got some other investors and put together the 200,000 pounds. So, they really scraped this thing together. But in many ways, the lack of budget made the movie better. And I'll talk about the very beginning of the movie and the very end of the movie in that context. And you'll see how it would have probably not been nearly as good a movie if it had not been for those serious budget and time constraints. So first, I'm going to play the beginning of the movie, slightly abridged, of course. But now you'll notice that, of course, there is no horse. It sounded like there was a horse, but in fact, it's a guy banging coconuts together. And they did that because they did not have the budget for horses. All through the movie, anytime there ought to be a horse, there's a guy banging coconuts together. It was one of the funniest things about the movie. And if they had more budget, they might not have thought of it. But in fact, one of them had some background in radio production and Foley type stuff. And they're like, hey, you know what? Let's just have a guy banging coconuts together. And it's one of the best things in the movie, and it kind of kicks off the movie in a very humorous note. So again, would that have happened if they'd had 5 times the budget? Maybe not. All right, I'm just going to advance to the next slide here. So my final example is from the end of the movie, and this is where the constraints are even more in evidence in ways that I'll talk about. So let me just switch back to YouTube here and get you that clip. All right, so this is the end of the movie. And that's the end of the movie, which is a good thing, because as it turns out, they had planned for a very elaborate and drawn out battle sequence between the French and the British troops in the movie. And it's would kind of been boring, I think, even if it was, done perfectly. You've been sitting there for an hour and a half, maybe close to 2 hours, and then the movie ends with some giant battle sequence. Not so much. But they ran out of money. And not only did they run out of money, they physically ran out of film. So it turns out that they only had so much film stock. This was back in the day when people shot, film. And on that day, they realized to their horror that they only had a few hundred feet of film stock before they ran out. And they're out in the middle of nowhere in Scotland. So it's not like they could even buy more film. So they decided that they would just pull things to a stop and that the police would come in and arrest. There was a whole subplot involving somebody being murdered earlier in the film, and so they're just like, the police will come in, call it over, and then the film will run out. And I don't know if that was actually the film running out. There may have been a little more to spare, but they came within, a certain number of feet of physically running out of film. And I think that's just an amazing example of constraints making the product better, because in fact, it was a great way to end the movie. Interestingly, all of the folks that you saw there were students from a local college. They paid them £2 to come for the day each, so about $3, and basically threw a bunch of medieval costumes on them and told them to run around and yell. So anyway, fabulous movie, and again, I think would have been significantly worse without the cost and time constraints that were involved. So I realize we've come a long way from Michelangelo's David to that, but I thought it would be a good arc to describe the different aspects in which creativity is impacted by constraints. Let me just, so that's the end of the talk, and I'm just going to put up my email contact info. If you do have any questions or want to learn more about any of this, feel free to drop me a note. Happy to talk about creativity or our software or most anything, as you can tell. So with that, I think we'll open things up for questions, and thanks for taking the time.
Thank you very much, Sam. That was very, very interesting pieces of information. I guess if anyone wants to ask a question, you can now send them to the chat, and Sam will then read them out. I think maybe while people are taking a second, just a brief question. How do you know all of this? Because this is quite a range of very inside information.
Well, the internet is a wonderful thing. I do remember I was a big fan of Monty Python, and I read a book once that detailed some of the struggles that they had filming the movie. And that's where I learned a lot of this. But a lot of it's on the, if you just look up Monty Python, Holy Grail struggle, you'll see all, and there was even a making of the movie that the BBC did. You can see some really great footage. It was shot in 1974 of them on location, joking around, having dead animals thrown at them, things like that. It's pretty fabulous if you're a Monty Python fan. Now the Apollo stuff, I was a kid then, and of course we all followed these things very closely. But of course everything is on the internet for that as well, and same goes for the Michelangelo story. It's pretty amazing that what he was able to do with with kind of a set piece of marble that was not intended for this use. They had a whole different plan for it originally, and then it fell through, and the original sculptor wasn't really able to do anything with it. So it's pretty wild the way that it came out of adverse circumstances.
Well, that's wonderful. Very curious mind. We now have a first question from Elisa Hecker. So if you want to take on from here.
Sure. Yeah, it says, "Hi Sam, great talk. How is Axel different from other MAMs?" That's a good question. Basically, our software is very simple and lightweight. So traditionally, MAM software is big, complex stuff, and we make it easy for smaller teams to do this kind of thing of like working remotely and.
Just a second, could you please clarify what MAMS?
Yes, absolutely. MAM stands for Media Asset Management. So it's a technical term, and it's basically a way of searching and managing your video content. So traditionally MAMs have been relatively expensive. In fact, when I was at Avid, I was in charge of one of those more expensive products. They can cost upwards of $500,000 and involve entire broadcast teams. But our idea with Axel was to do something much simpler and lighter that could be deployed by as little as 2 or 3 people. So it's just kind of the same concept, but brought down to more practical levels for most people. And again, maybe a bit of constraints there, right? If you have an unlimited budget, you can build a huge, massive piece of software, but people may not always enjoy using it. Whereas if you have to do something smaller and more affordable, then it almost has to be usable, because there are no system administrators to go run to if you need help.
Thank you, Sam. If anybody else has any questions, feel free to write them in the chat. In the meantime, something just popped into my head. So your talk was all around sort of coming up with unconventional ways with dealing with very sudden problems, and you're also now working in machine learning. So I guess I know little about machine learning, like the standard amount that you feed the AI some data, and then they make predictive behaviors based on what they learned. Do you feel like there is a way to train an AI to come up with unconventional solutions for spontaneous problems?
That is a good question. I think with today's AI, it's a stretch. The kinds of AI that we use in our software do things like speech transcription and face recognition. So if you throw it a curveball and you ask it to solve a different problem, you'll get completely random stuff, and maybe no stuff at all. But as AI gets more powerful, the key here is that it's about the number of layers and the complexity of the engine that's doing the deep learning. And today's systems use maybe a half dozen layers. But as time goes on and the data scientists figure out ways to build more sophisticated systems, those layers feed into higher level layers, which at some point may even feed into what's called a semantic understanding of the world. In other words, you would understand the difference between a video and an image and a piece of paper. And, you know, a computer has no idea about these things, but over time, a deep learning system can build a worldview. Once you have that worldview, you can solve unconventional problems. You know, you say, well, the side of your spaceship is blown off. How do you get oxygen to the crew? And today's AI engines would never be able to do that. But I suspect that in 5 or 10 years, we will be at the point where, with enough additional layers and enough semantic understanding of what's going on, that in fact, you could start to see useful results out of that. Okay, we've got some additional questions from Dan Mussman. Thank you, Sam. I think the entire Python canon is constraint-driven creativity. Excellent example for your insightful presentation. Thank you. Okay, so appreciate the comment. And another person, Plian, said, thank you for the presentation. Never knew the background of the coconuts. So excellent. Nope, I'm happy to have provided some new knowledge here. And this is actually the first time I've given this presentation. So look forward to any feedback, and I'll probably end up refining it and evolving it a little bit going forward. Although, you know, actually we planned for a half hour and we're right there. So if there are no other questions, I think we will wrap it up. But again, feel free to email me at the address shown on the screen. And I mean, this is the first ever creativity conference. So many thanks to Maxime and Sonia and everybody on the team. They did an amazing job of pulling this together, and I'm looking forward to future events of the same kind.
And this is truly just the beginning, and you can join us yourself, Sam, as an attendee for all the other meetings that we have.
That's right. It goes on. It's the next 2 days, isn't it?
Yes, it's all day today, and there are 6 rooms, and who knows what's going on in some other room, you know. Yesterday, for example, I attended another online conference of a different sort, and somebody hacked into a Zoom meeting and absolutely took over.
Oh no.
So I guess we're the lucky ones, and look out for the hackers. But it's been a very good start to the day. Thank you very much. So we'll now all take a break, and then you can follow the schedule to join all of our other meetings, and drop an email to Sam if you have any other questions. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Have a good day.